Hi, everyone. So happy to have you back today for Bytes of Good Live. If you don't already know, Bytes of Good Live is a monthly speaker series hosted by Hack for Impact, with the goal of engaging both Hack for Impact members and our greater community in critical discussions about technology, the role it plays in our society, and career paths in the social good space. Shelly Kurtz, the co-founder and chief marketing officer of Giving Tech Labs, is joining us today to talk all about tech for the public interest and X for Impact, a market intelligence platform for social innovation. We will start with a presentation from Shelly, then go into a short moderated Q&A before taking questions from all of you. So please feel free to send any questions you have in the chat throughout the event, and we will answer them all at the end. Thank you so much, Shelly, for being here, and I'm so excited to hear what you have to share with us today.
Thanks, everyone.
Awesome.
Thanks for joining. I know there are a million other things you could have been doing, but I'm so glad that you're here. I think you'll learn a couple things and hopefully be inspired about your future career paths and about how the work that you're doing now in the Hack for Impact program can potentially be amplified and leveraged to create more technology for the public interest and plug in to solve real-world problems experienced by other nonprofit organizations. So I will go ahead and get started with really defining what technology for the public interest is. You may have heard various versions of this, but at Giving Tech Labs, we create tech for the public interest, tech for PI, because we really wanted to look at this intersection between technology solutions and innovations and best-in-class solutions, and looking at where we could lean in on the social sector problems that were really not being addressed with existing general market tools. And if we could give a voice to those experiencing pain points by listening and understanding where technology could level up, the thesis is that we could save money for all of those other nonprofits experiencing that same pain, and we can also create really strong business models that can be addressing these impact areas so that engineers coming out of school don't have to decide between doing well and doing good, and that we can create this ecosystem where you can apply your best talents and be able to build solutions for the future. So Tech for PI is really inspired by the public interest technology movement that is in many universities across the country, and is really starting with a philosophy and a principle about bringing this multidisciplinary approach to the creation of solutions. And some of your schools may be part of the Public Interest Technology University Network. There are about 36 schools now that are participating, including Stanford and others. And it was also inspired by the idea that really created public interest law back in the 1950s, where it first had to be something that was conceptualized and then it was actualized. And many of you may not know that public interest law was really so instrumental because it predated the civil rights movement in the US. And if we wouldn't have had curriculum in the universities and the idea that public interest law was important, it would not have borne the fruits that it did, like the ACLU and other organizations that became so instrumental in defending civil liberties among those that needed the most support. And so technology for the public interest is not a product or a company. It's really a movement that is about bridging this gap between the needs that exist and the traditional ideals that have been in place, which has been about private sector companies being in the general market and the nonprofits left to solve problems on their own. And instead, we want to create this bridge where we can focus on measurable and systemic impact. That number one, we're using data to measure what we're doing and not just talking about creating tech for good and not just measuring success by how many users there are, but really about solving the core problem. And number two, that if you are creating technology solutions inside nonprofit organizations and other social sector impact areas that you're looking at building that operational capacity so that when you leave, they have the ability to sustain that technology, either through partnerships or really upskilling, and ideally through technology solutions that are self-healing, with software as a service that can continually ship new features and patches that those users do not need to be able to maintain on their own. Third, we want to make sure there's always an ethical application of technology, which is really important now when we're looking at AI and a lot of the data privacy implications, that even if you have the best of intentions about creating tech for good solutions, it's really important to have that governance inside, because I guarantee you will come to that inflection point at some point where you are looking at a customer opportunity, whether it's at a hospital or a school or in a homeless shelter or some other impact opportunity that is going to really pull at you, and you want to solve that through your platform for that customer, and yet you need to think about the other side in terms of the applications of all of these other factors in terms of privacy and data structure, so that you can scale appropriately and be able to have guardrails in place. Fourth, we want to make sure that you are harnessing the power of the cloud and this great aggregation of data to be able to help customers and users be able to feel really included in the process, so that what you are building is not as important as why you are building it, and making sure that if you are serving nonprofits and social sector users, that you really understand how very different their challenges are than yours. And one example of that is that we created a tech solution a few years ago for nonprofit organizations. And when one of our employees was explaining how to do something with the tool, how to access the tool, it's very simple. It was a cloud-based system. So we just asked that person to type in the URL in their browser. And the person said, "I don't have a browser." So our employee said, "No problem. How do you get to the internet?" And she said, "Oh, I just click on the MSN button." And so we said, "Great, click on the MSN button and then type in www." And we continued on with that tutorial. But it's really important to understand that if you are creating technology solutions for an audience that is not like you, that you take a step back and include them at the table, so that when you think you have a really excellent user interface, you understand how that feels to the other side. And lastly, you want to always create change through collective impact, which means bringing together stakeholders across sectors, the private sector, the public sector, nonprofits that are doing the work in that impact area, potentially even funders, and of course those end beneficiaries, so that you have a holistic approach, because no one tech company is going to be able to solve these problems alone. And what we were really sort of inspired by is looking at all of the different amazing technology solutions that are part of our everyday life, and how the cloud has completely changed the dynamic in which we shop and communicate and do our business. And for most of you, these things are not surprising, because you're digital natives, you've had these tools. But for those of us that are a little longer in the tooth, it's been really revolutionary to see the speed at which technology innovation has completely changed the workflows for personal and business productivity. And yet we have so many of society's urgent issues that are just as important to have solutions built. And so we look at those same minutes and see what happens, not only from a social impact perspective and what could be done to solve it, but even if you don't think about those end problems, there's a financial incentive for our country and for our world. These particular stats just have to do with the United States, but you can look at the correlation between these impact areas. For example, that 41 million individuals experience hunger every minute in the US, 11 million of those are children, and yet every minute we throw away over $300,000 of food. And that's a matching problem. And that it can be just as inspiring and stimulating intellectually to solve this problem as it is to create the next dating app or Instagram filter. So we really want to inspire people to think about the real problems that can be solved and the ways to apply tech for good across those impact areas. And if you're wondering about the size of the market and if there's an opportunity in a room, a space for you, there is. There are over 1 million nonprofit organizations in the US, which represents a total addressable market over $2 trillion. And that would be the 10th largest economy if you ranked it by GDP. So it would be its own fiefdom. So there's definitely opportunity. It also happens to be larger than the software as a service market globally. So if you think that there is no money to be made in software solutions for social problem solving, you're wrong. There is a healthy ecosystem, and whenever you can create some unit of value, you can operationalize a business if you're thoughtful in doing so. So I just wanted to take a step back and give you a few stats about Giving Tech Labs. We are an innovation center based in the Seattle area, and we were founded in 2017. My co-founder is a former Microsoft executive that was one of the co-founders of what became Office 365 and went on to be a serial entrepreneur. And together we have created 7 social enterprises, and we have helped a lot of people over these last 4 years and learned a lot, created a lot of patents and an IP around social tech. And we really want to help others be able to scale and do the same thing that we did. And so I wanted to share a little bit of a case study to bring it back down to earth about how exactly we create technology for the public interest and hopefully spark some ideas for your future. So we first learned about this problem of child sexual abuse by going to a listening session that we organized in Omaha, Nebraska. And we asked nonprofit leaders from a variety of different organizations to really just join us and talk about all of the different things that they wish that mobile cloud technology could solve in their areas of work. And someone raised their hand and explained the issue of child sexual abuse in the US and the fact that there were all of these nonprofit organizations working to protect the child after an allegation of abuse occurs. But it was a very low-tech manual process that involved creating DVDs and even in some cases VHS tapes to record a child forensic interview so that it could mitigate the PTSD of the child having to retell their story over and over again, but also be available for prosecution and criminal justice, law enforcement, and all of the myriad of professionals involved in that case. And so the problem was that they were burning DVDs and distributing them in some cases up to 10 times. And as you can imagine, the DVDs would get lost or stolen or mishandled. We even heard of cases that would end up having those videos end up on YouTube. And if any of you on the call, I know there are those of you on the call who have survived child sexual abuse, and it would be the most re-traumatizing situation to think that that is ever possible. And so we knew that there was a tech solution that we could create to solve this problem. And so we created VidaNyx, and Vida means life in Spanish, and Nyx is the god that rules over gods and men. So it is literally the protector of life. And we built VidaNyx from the ground up based on that conversation in Omaha, Nebraska, and doing further research to learn that there wasn't an existing cloud-based solution to share and distribute these forensic interviews digitally. So we created it, and today it's the leading digital evidence solution serving now over 100 different child advocacy centers around the US, helping almost 10,000 individual users, which represent prosecutors and law enforcement investigators and child protective services representatives. But most importantly, it's protecting over 32,000 videos of children who have been abused. And we're really proud of this Tech for PI story. And it's not only having social impact that you can see, saving time and money, but it's also having an ability to create shared data sets to be able to help these nonprofit organizations understand their own workflow like they've never been able to do before. They know how many times a law enforcement officer has viewed the video. They can share content now with social distancing in place without having to drive across town or across the state. And it can speed up the healing of the child and create a lot of peace of mind for these agencies and the families. So I want you to know that we've created technology from the ground up, been there in the very early stages like you are, struggling with specs and understanding the features and knowing nothing about that particular subject, but really wanting to help make a difference. And we now successfully are on the other side of that. We launched the MVP in November of 2018. And last December, we raised a Series A for VidaNyx, and it exited Giving Tech Labs with a $5 million equity round and is now being operated independently back in Omaha, where we originally started with a growing team. And as a little, advertisement for them, if anyone's looking for career opportunities, VidaNyx is hiring, and it's a great opportunity to look at companies that are doing well and doing good. So I just wanted to sort of shift gears and say that, we went from creating on the ground this specific point solution to being on the world stage with Amazon Web Services as the case study that they chose for their global nonprofit conference. And it gave us the opportunity to zoom out from the very specific niche problem of child sexual abuse and protecting those interviews to helping other nonprofits realize that there was a way to harness the cloud to be able to utilize AI and scaled solutions and systemic approaches. And we were overwhelmed with interest of nonprofits saying, we need a solution. We have a problem. We love this approach. And so that's what really got us thinking, what if we organized all of the big problems to be solved, and we included the sources of funding and all of the existing solutions so that the research that we did at Giving Tech Labs was really available to everyone. And the model was open so that we could really spark social innovation at scale. And so that's what we did with the creation of X for Impact. And Microsoft's Tech for Social Impact team partnered with us on this vision. And it was really to create one single space online that was democratizing access to data, where you could see the problems to be solved. So you may be inspired to create a solution, or if you're a solution provider, you could easily make sure that your solution was discoverable by nonprofits, which otherwise may have not been aware that solutions like VidaNyx exist. But also for you to find grant opportunities and for funders to look at deal flow, whether it's in supporting social entrepreneurs or investing in scaled solutions to some of those problems. And we created a taxonomy using the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And you may have heard of these before. We just had the Davos agenda a couple weeks ago, but there are 17 global goals that the countries of the United Nations agreed to address. And it creates a really nice framing so that we can look at how solutions may work across particular organizations and widen the scope. And so we organize our content around those SDGs. And if you haven't visited x4i.org yet, I would love to invite you to. And we have a special opportunity for you to be a contributing editor. And that gives you publishing rights so that you are able to create a challenge or submit your ideas. If you have some working prototypes or you've helped an organization with a particular problem that you think may be able to help another organization, you're able to add those insights directly onto the platform. So you can see the code and go ahead and submit that through the website, and we'll get you set up as a publisher to allow some additional access rights into the tool. But if you haven't been there before, you'll be hopefully pleasantly surprised that we have aggregated challenges by UN SDG. So if you're very passionate about climate action, you could look at challenges and existing solutions and resources and funding just in that particular area, or you can look across the board at a variety of different tech for good solutions and the money flow and grants available. So I encourage you to use that even as a consumer, or you may find it helpful for some of your research papers. We have articles from trusted sources and a lot of data points that you won't find anywhere else, because we've analyzed over 600,000 990 forms, which are the IRS filings for nonprofit organizations and foundations in the US, as well as over 50,000 SEC filings. So we also have the private sector money flow to show if this is an investable area and how that has changed over time. And it's exciting to see that in most of the United Nations Sustainable Development areas, there has been a V-shaped recovery since COVID, and investing has increased. And so there are still dollars going towards those Series A rounds in tech for good companies addressing an issue such as quality education or reduced inequality or life on land. And I wanted to just highlight a couple examples, because it may be confusing to think about what a social tech solution might look like. And we have a broad spectrum on X for Impact, everything from early seed stage startups that are in market and trying to find their traction to very scaled $100 million companies that have created a niche of technology for the public interest. So this particular one is called AutoLung. It's a great idea that was really sparked at the beginning of COVID last year, when there was such a ventilator shortage, particularly in the developing world, in the global south and rural areas that didn't have access to mainstream hospitals and expensive equipment. And AutoLung is a startup that created a low-cost way to create a ventilator using $200, less than 2 hours. And it's a software-based approach. And so they're using X for Impact to gain visibility among funders and also find partners with rural and tribal organizations in the US, and to understand the market opportunity and apply for grants to be able to facilitate the continued development of their software application, so that hospitals and even individual consumers around the globe have that access to a low-cost tool to be able to create life-saving feedback on their respiration. The next one is at the other end of the spectrum. Footprint is a really cool technology company that you've probably used without knowing it. They create plant-based compostable products like this bowl that one of the co-founders is showing in the picture. And I love this story because these were guys like you. They came out of working together at Intel after college, and they were processing the silicon chips and started realizing that there was a sort of off-gassing, a dust that came from these plastic chips. And they started thinking about the effects of plastic on the oceans and the environment, and ultimately human health. And so they left Intel with the idea to create an alternative to plastic. And so they're a materials science company, and they are doing phenomenal work with Fortune 500 companies, partnering with companies like ConAgra and consumer fast food chains, and even their products in Trader Joe's and other locations. You'll see, if you ever have a plant-based container, if you see the footprint logo at the bottom, you'll know it's this company, but they have many patents, and they're really working to not only create consumer education and additional products that can be alternatives to plastic, but working a lot on the advocacy side and research around the medical impacts of all of our use of plastic, and have really created some amazing work in this space, and really bridging that gap between a for-profit company and the nonprofit world, and partnering even to create a foundation so that they are supporting the work that they are trying to protect. So lastly, I'm just going to leave you with a concept that drives everything that we do at Giving Tech Labs, and certainly has driven those entrepreneurs that I just highlighted, from Auto Lung to Footprint, and that I want you to take with you. And it's the concept of ikigai. And that's a Japanese word that means your reason for being, your reason for waking up every day. And our ikigai collectively is technology for the public interest, but it is the answer to 4 questions: what you love to do, what you're good at, what you can get paid for, and what the world needs. And so I really encourage you to think about that, because it may sound like a simple equation, but oftentimes you'll find that what you're good at isn't necessarily what you love, or what you love may not be what you can get paid for. So you really want to strive to be right in the middle of that Venn diagram, and be able to not have to have the trade-off to go work for the man and then go do what you love later, but be able to find a place where you can truly be living your ikigai every day. And we believe that with technology for the public interest, that is possible. And we would encourage you to follow your ikigai. And I wanted to leave you with this. This is one of my friends, and a very inspirational person that you can definitely Google if you don't know her. She's the first and only person from Korea to ever go to space. Her name is Dr. So-Yen Yi. And she says her favorite quote is, "Earth is the cradle of humanity, but one cannot remain in the cradle forever. Humanity needs to leave our cradle and explore." And the reason I share that with you is because I want you to look at what hasn't been done before. And in order to do that, you have to leave your comfort zone and start thinking about the problems from those who live it. And so you may have to get out of your bubble and start listening and asking the right questions. And I hope that you can use X for Impact as a resource to get you closer to that dream, to live your ikigai and build technology for the public interest. So I appreciate this time with you today, and I'm happy to answer any questions that have come through.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shelly. I really, really appreciate it. And especially at the beginning, those Tech for PI principles are super relevant to all the work that we're doing at Hack for Impact. All of you that are on project teams right now should be keeping all of those principles in mind. So I really appreciate you sharing those. Now we have a few questions related to Giving Tech Labs and X for Impact. And then we will answer any questions that have come in from people watching. So just to start off, I think one of the principles that you mentioned in the beginning was about measuring impact and making sure that what you're doing is actually having the effect that you want and having a good impact on whatever community you're working with. So how are you able to measure the impact of the different initiatives that Giving Tech Labs has?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we really want to measure not activity, but outcomes. And if you focus on that, it will get you closer to the truth. And we want to turn data into knowledge. So there's a lot of different ways that you can get data using Google Analytics or all of the different tools you may build into the work that you're creating for nonprofits. But ultimately, impact is the way that it's defined by that particular mission. And so in the case of VidaNyx, the number one impact metric that matters most is protecting the children, because that's where we started. That's the problem we want to solve. And so all of the other pieces in terms of how many people visit the website or the usage isn't as important as getting to that key metric of how many children are protected. And so you really want to make sure that it's transparent and visible in everything you do. And if you can't see it, it's really easy to forget when you're building product specs and shipping new features, and then you're really just focused on getting to the next sprint instead of remembering why. And so if you have that why in front of you all the time, it's much harder to forget. And so we advocate for actually having public dashboards. So in the case of VidaNyx and X for Impact 2, we show that data in real time. So if you go to vidanyx.com/impact, the impact report is there and it's updated every single day. So you can see how many children are protected and all of those other metrics that I shared during the presentation, because that's what matters. And so I think defining that is sometimes tricky, even for organizations, because there tends to be a focus on activity. How many meals were served or how many new staff were hired, instead of looking at, are we reducing the original problem set? And to me, the biggest compliment that you can have as a nonprofit is to put yourself out of business, because you have really address the root cause issue. And if it's a supply and demand game, that there's no longer the same supply of, those in need. And I think that there's sometimes becomes a focus the other way on how much money has an organization raised, instead of looking at, are they solving the core problem? And there's a great book if you're interested in that type of perspective, and it's called Geek Heresy by Dr. Kentaro Toyama. And he was a researcher at Microsoft and really talked about looking at all of the key sort of indicators across the globe in terms of, maternal, infant mortality rate and some of these other global indicators. And that if technology was the answer, if it was the way, the truth, and the light, that at the outset of the internet and mobile computing and all of these other tools, you would have thought there would have been an inverse relationship, that these health problems and other global impact metrics would have been reduced in size while technology was more accessible and ubiquitous. And the reality is they've been going in the same direction. More problems, more technology. So we really do need to make sure that we're measuring on outcomes and not just how many meters are spinning.
That's a really good point, that even we need to remember doing that. And I never thought about more problems, more technology. That's a good thing to keep in mind, and also look at the broader picture and see how all these different solutions collectively, if they are actually helping some of these problems and doing what they intended. So another question we have is just for you on a personal note. You co-founded Giving Tech Labs. So when did you know it was time to start that organization?
That's a great question. Well, I was not born an entrepreneur. This was not my ikigai. My ikigai is human connections. And so this was a means to an end, because I really care about helping people. But if you really want the story, it was someone else that pushed me to do this. And I think that happens a lot in life, that sometimes you need someone to see something in you that you may not see in yourself. So it was my partner, and he approached me to partner. And I really, really recommend a partnership approach, because being an entrepreneur is not for the faint of heart. And I recently read, I think last week, Elon Musk was asked a question that came from an audience member, and they wanted to know what advice would you give an entrepreneur. And sort of his answer was like, or what encouragement would you give an entrepreneur? And his answer was, if you need an encouraging word, don't be an entrepreneur. And so the idea is, it is very lonely and hard and tough to grit out, particularly if you think about the world that we live in now with COVID and being isolated and models changing and trends shifting. And having a partner really, really does help, to have someone in the foxhole, particularly if you're doing things that have never been done before. So I guess the short answer is that that Luis, my business partner, asked to do this together. And he had started many companies in the past, and he recognized the importance of having someone to have that balanced approach with, and having someone in your corner, but also with complementary skill sets. And so I would highly recommend, seeking out mentors. He was a mentor of mine when I was at my previous startup, and everyone needs someone. So even if it's not literally a partnership, I think if you can find those who have done it before, it will help you understand if you're cut out for it. And having been at a startup before I founded my own company, I already understood the landscape. And the biggest factor is speed. Is just the velocity is so very different. And I came from corporate America, where I had spent almost 20 years before. And Luis, my partner, really helped me understand when I was at my last startup that startup time is very different than corporate time. It's almost like the analogy of dog years, that for every year a dog lives is like 7 in human life. And, he told me that really 6 months at a startup is like, 6 years in the outside world. And that really helped give me perspective in terms of the velocity of, sort of pivoting and change and traction needed, and just the intensity of a startup. And so, whether or not you're ready to found a company, I would say, probably has a lot to do with your ability to handle stress, and whether or not you can withstand that pace. And if not, that's okay. But I think you really need to understand that being in a startup or founding a startup is not very much about the technology, and is much more about the psychology of it, because the tech is going to change, right? The technology that your kids will use hasn't even been invented yet. So it's really about having that mental fortitude to be able to adapt and shift.
That's really great advice, and I like that you acknowledge that having a partner can be really, really helpful to do that and handle all of those challenges. And it's super cool that you've been able to do that successfully and start all of these other initiatives under Giving Tech Labs. I've looked at a few of them, and they all look super important and super interesting. And that actually leads us to our next question of, how does Giving Tech Labs decide which ventures to take on as an organization?
Good question. Yeah, we use a model that is not that different from the model that VCs or traditional investors may look at. First, we ask if it's a systemic problem, or is this a problem that is experienced only by one organization or a small region. And the way that we define systemic is at least impacting the United States and potentially global. So if we know, for example, that a homeless shelter has a problem tracking immigrant records, for example, and wants a tech solution, we would not build a tech solution for that one homeless shelter. We would want to understand, is this a problem experienced by all of the homeless shelters in the US? Most, some. So what is that total addressable market for that problem set? Because we don't want to be part of the problem by adding one more custom piece of tech. We want to look at the aggregated whole because we know there's so many benefits in creating peer learning and benchmarking and having that aggregated data, as well as an economy of scale so that everyone pays a low price and there's continual software improvement. So one is it systemic? The next one is this a solved problem? Because what we've often found is that there's just not enough research on the front side to see and learn that there are already existing solutions. And examples have come to us where nonprofit organizations wanted to build a map tool, for example, showing where a variety of different programs were around the US. And they wanted us to build this custom tool. And so the first thing that we did is say, well, for like $50 a month, you can get a WordPress plugin that will solve like 90% of your problem. Is it really worth all of that money to get those extra 5 or 10% in features and benefits? And they had no idea that something like that existed. So there's kind of a tech literacy gap sometimes, or just we see entrepreneurs that are just so passionate about their idea that they never even bother to search to see if there's anyone out there that has already done that. And so that's one of the problems we're solving at X for Impact, that in the case that we just talked about, that you could go and search for homelessness and see the existing solutions that are already homeless shelter case management tools and very specific niche solutions that were built just for that persona of homeless shelter staff and volunteers, and see, is that something that's already existing and can we leverage that here? Or is there a particular feature or a partnership that could be developed? So once we recognize that there is nothing in that class, then we move on to looking at whether or not there is enough funding and monetization potential. And we also look at the sort of difficulty to code as a rubric, sort of the ability to monetize and how difficult is it to code, because we want to try to maintain discipline to go from idea to MVP within 9 months. And then from MVP to sustainability, which we define as at least $500,000 in revenue within the next 9 months. So by 18 months, you could see a path where you can ship a product, find a market, and have revenue supporting it. And so those are the criteria that we look at before we dive into a new area to explore a technology solution.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And especially for Hack for Impact, we build software for a lot of individual organizations. And it's a good reminder to make sure that we are always looking out if there is an existing solution, and X for Impact is a great way and a great tool for us to use to do this. So super excited that you have been able to share that with us today, but making sure that we are not making the problem any more complicated or just creating another specific solution that isn't able to, or that isn't already in existence for that organization. I think let's move on to some of the questions from the audience. So I'm going to share them on the screen.
Okay.
So the first one that we have is, how did you get started in tech for the public interest, and what problems are you most interested in solving?
Thank you for the question. So my background is I came from the private sector. I went to college and studied communication and Spanish, so not CS. And I started in broadcast television and then went through a career in digital media right at the turn of the century, if you will, probably when most of you were born. But then, as I mentioned, went on to work at NBCUniversal, and coming from a media and entertainment background, I was not thinking about tech for PI specifically, but my work was serving underserved communities and working with different cultural groups and providing content to marginalized communities, whether they were immigrants from Asia or Latin America or the Middle East. And when I had started my career, I was in public affairs, and I worked a lot on community engagement and working with nonprofit organizations. So I did sort of have this feeling in the back of my head of always wanting to have impact and finding ways to have an up-leveled, scaled approach as opposed to one-on-one, which is certainly fulfilling. My husband and I had a little brother through big brothers, big sisters, and there's lots of reasons why you may connect to certain people to help them or certain organizations. But my perspective had always been build it once and serve millions. And so when I started to feel like I wasn't living my ikigai and wanting to reconnect with having work that really mattered, that felt impactful and meaningful, I started thinking about the best practices from the sort of private sector that I just knew to be true, these foundational elements about how to go to market, how to brand, how to connect with users and build a subscriber base, all of those things. And I saw such a gap in the nonprofit sector where these teachings and learnings had not transferred over. And there was such a thirst for knowledge and a lack of data where we were used to real-time daily report cards on all of our key metrics. We saw this approach of annual manual reports. And so I think just seeing that I could be of service and of help from my background was really what inspired me to be able to dive in and to create Giving Tech Labs with my partner and try to apply these best practices from the private sector into creating technology solutions for those who really hadn't had a voice, hadn't had a seat at the table. No one had really ever asked them, how can technology better serve you? They were used to getting the sort of sloppy seconds of whatever was the free software, or after it had gone through several iterations in the general market, they finally get what had already been outdated. And so they were sort of living with the burden of technology. So it had not been seen as an enabler. It was seen as something that was another bureaucratic step. And that's because it was never created for them. So we wanted to reverse that model and build from the ground up. And in the question of my personal passion areas about which problems I'm most interested in solving, personally, I'm a mom, and I would just say that protecting children is really something that is close to me. And with VidaNyx, it's one of the reasons why when I heard about the problem of these unprotected forensic interviews, I immediately knew that that was a problem that I had to solve, that it was a solvable problem, and if not me, who? And so I want to continue advocating for children and for survivors of sexual abuse and those that are less fortunate and don't have a voice. I think also issues of equity are really important, and to be able to use your voice in a way that matters, particularly as a woman in tech and someone who's Hispanic and representing a community that isn't usually represented in tech conversations. I'm passionate about that advocacy work and making sure that there is representation moving forward. So those are a couple of my personal issues.
Awesome. That's so great to hear what you are personally interested in while you are also working on so many amazing causes with all your work, and especially with Expert Impact, enabling other people to do that and solve these problems at scale. I think in terms of time, this will be our last question. And I think it sets it up really well for the end of this conversation. So what resources would you recommend for students who want to get involved in tech for the public interest? And I'd also add on to that, if you have any general advice for students as well, for who want to get into this space.
Yeah. Well, I love that, Eric. And I would say that number one, this is a recommendation I make to all students. And so if you haven't done it yet, it's another reminder, but create a LinkedIn profile, number one. I know that sounds like a very grown-up thing to do, or something that you don't consider as a social network because you're using other tools, or you don't think it's important because you have your GitHub repository or whatever your rationale is. But this is something that's really important if you want to be seen and be at the table and be able to have people like me recommend people like you for these opportunities, you need to fish where the fish are. So that's a really simple one that I would say: create a LinkedIn profile and start following the organizations, for-profit and nonprofit, that are in the impact area that is most appealing to you. And if that's broader system change, there are lots of foundations and nonprofits that are working in that area. Or if it's a more niche specific area, start doing that so that you can start seeing the conversations that are happening and understanding what is really happening in that space and where the opportunities to lean in might be, whether that is to create a tech solution or potentially get experience as a grant maker or working in the field to be able to have that customer intimacy. And as a reminder, I know we've been talking about technology, but as you can tell from me, I am not someone who writes code. So it's a very broad field that needs all different kinds of disciplines: anthropology and global policy and data science, and a lot of different tool sets. So when I say technology, it's the broad ecosystem of being in this space, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you are an engineer. So I would say get a LinkedIn profile, follow people that are active in this space. Definitely use the free resources at X for Impact to research the problems, research the solutions that are existing. And I would say that my homework assignment for you, Eric, and others would be: find 3 companies on X for Impact that you're inspired by and reach out and contact them, learn about them. And many of them are hiring or may in the future be hiring, or they may have an internship opportunity. And even if they don't have one posted, if you initiate that communication and show that gumption, most likely you will be rewarded. And because I started with the LinkedIn, I will just tell you that I highly recommend the LinkedIn approach because it has actually worked. I have hired interns that have reached out to me through cold LinkedIn messages because they like what we're doing as a company and they want to connect. And there's something different about seeing a face to a name and seeing a legitimate background in terms of your education or other internships you've done that will make an executive take a second to look versus an email that is just sort of faceless and nameless. It's just a little bit trickier because it puts the onus on the recipient to do some due diligence, which can be a little exhausting, and they may not find anything about you, and therefore you may be in the sort of spam folder. So those are some of the things that I would say would be important. And really understand the opportunity by those that are already in it. Make as many connections as you can.
That is amazing advice, and always a good reminder to, I guess, take a chance, message somebody on LinkedIn, even if you don't already know them. And I know I have learned a lot from that just by speaking with people in the social good space. Even if it doesn't lead to a job, you can always learn so much by talking to these individuals who are already doing something that you might want to do in the future. So thank you so much for that. And unfortunately, we are all out of time, but thank you again, Shelly, for speaking with us today. And thank you to everyone else who's watching for attending our event. I'm super excited to announce that our next event will be on February 25th, and we will be learning all about design ethics. So if you're interested in that, make sure to check out bytesofgood.org to register for this next event. You can now also find all of our past events and podcast episodes on our website as well. So thank you again to everyone who came, and we can't wait to have you back in a few weeks. Thank you again so much, Shelly.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.